Welcome back to the Most Accurate Podcast. My name is Anthony Stalter, joined as always by John Paulsen, 4for4.com. We appreciate everybody joining us again. It's week, 5 now in the NFL, which it's crazy, John. We're already into October. And if any indication, if the rest of the season is any indication of what we saw on Thursday night, I don't know how exciting it's going to be from a fantasy perspective, unless you just load your team up with the best kickers.
Yeah, I mean, it looked like I made a good decision not to watch the game. I was going to turn it on if it was looking interesting or good. It was a close game, so there's that. But all I did was check the scores. I checked it on Twitter. Everybody was complaining about the game, so I just watched Welcome to Wrexham with my wife and had a good time.
There you go. Yeah, it was not pretty whatsoever. But we will get into John's Thursday night takeaways. This week's biggest fantasy storylines, one of the big ones, involves a lot of tight ends that are banged up right now. And we do have the sleeper sneaky start of the week. I actually nailed that one this time, John.
Very
nice.
I
don't want to jinx myself, but regular listeners / watchers have known that I've hacked that up. I love sleeper. For some reason, I want to combine sleeper and sneaky and make sleepy, but I'm going to try not to do that today. So we got all of that coming up, and of course the breakout receiver model, which I believe, John, and maybe you can give us an update. I believe that breakout model did pretty well last week, if I remember correctly. So we'll get into all that, but I do want to start off with your takeaways from last night. Again, unless you had the under on basically every prop except something that involves a kicker, you probably weren't too happy watching that game. It was a lot of ugly football. No Jonathan Taylor for the Colts. But I know that one thing that you wanted to highlight was Denver's backfield situation with Javonte Williams out.
Yeah, this has been multiple questions this week in our 4for4 Discord on Twitter, discussing it on Wednesday with John Daigle and Sam Hoppen. What is going to happen with this Javonte Williams injury? What does that lead to? We saw last night with Latavius Murray, just too quick of a turnaround, trying to come back from London and get ready to play in this game. I call this the looking for his apartment week. He's probably not going to play, and he didn't, especially with a Thursday kickoff. So we got a lot of Melvin Gordon, 18 touches. He went over 100 total yards, did not score a touchdown. Obviously, nobody scored a touchdown. But Mike Boone rotated in for 10 touches, was pretty productive in his touches as well. So, right now that's what we have. I think when you get Latavius Murray, this is a nice audition for Boone. Unless you have to look at his pass blocking numbers, unless he blew a block or something, he looks like he did pretty well in his 10-touch role. They signed Latavius as depth, but, I think those of us who've been around and remember Latavius Murray's fantasy value over the years, he looked pretty good in London, and he's got a pretty good chance to usurp Boone. And as long as Melvin Gordon doesn't fumble the ball, I think he's the lead back in that backfield.
What did you make of Indy's backfield without Jonathan Taylor?
Yeah, we lost Nyheim Hines immediately. Like, this was his chance to carry the load. He got concussed. I hope he's okay. But these first quarter injuries are just killer for your fantasy squads. And I think the interesting thing looking at this backfield heading into this game is we just didn't know Deion Jackson versus Phillip Lindsay, how the team viewed Deion Jackson as like an actual running back versus just a special teamer. Because sometimes that third running back that's active is just active for special teams. And then they will elevate a guy from the practice squad in this situation with Taylor out. And that player will be kind of deemed the better runner and will kind of take over the number 2 spot behind Hines in this situation. So I was curious to see, like, would it be Lindsay? Would it be Deion Jackson? And you look at Deion Jackson over at Player Profiler, and he's like 220 and really athletic and has a nice profile. So it turned out that he is the lead back, or the third back, I guess, with Hines and Taylor both out. He ended up with 13 carries, 62 yards, 4.8 yards per carry, 4 catches for 29 yards. One of the bright spots for that offense. Lindsay did get 11 carries and 3 catches, so he had 14 touches. A pretty healthy backfield for that for the Colts. So I think probably Jonathan Taylor might be back next week. this week was definitely pushing it, and he didn't make it back. And then Hines probably will be back next week with a concussion. He's got 10 days to recover. So we'll see how we're heading into week 6 with this backfield.
All right, not much else to break down unless, John, you've been studying, a lot of kicker mechanics and you want to break down the 2 kickers from last night. If not, we'll move on to this week's biggest fantasy storylines. And let's start off with the tight end position because there's a couple of interesting injuries to follow. One that we followed all week has been Kyle Pitts. The other one just happened recently. But let's start off with Kyle Pitts. Did not practice again on Thursday, did not practice on Wednesday. He's dealing with a hamstring injury. And John, as you know, hamstring injuries tend to be a little tricky, especially when it comes to forecasting whether or not a guy is going to play. But let's start off with Kyle Pitts. If he practices Friday, great. But what if he doesn't practice today?
Yeah, Kyle Pitts, Gerald Everett, and then Dawson Knox was also ruled out just this morning. So what I'm going to do is just kind of give listeners, viewers, all of my sneaky starts for the tight end position because people are scrambling trying to find players to play. If Pitts plays, you got to play him. Unless you have a really top-notch option. Everett, maybe Donald Parham, but it's actually been Trey McKittle. Not McKittle. What's the guy's name that's been playing behind? Bear with me, folks, as I vamp. Trey McKitty. I knew it was something, Mick something. He's been playing. Parham has been injured, but we'll see how he's able to get going. And if Everett's out, then you might have an interesting play there, but not really sure who's the number 2 there right this moment. So, looking at some other options. I don't know if Logan Thomas is available, probably in shallower leagues. He's got the 29th rated, 29th adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends, the Tennessee matchup. He's got target counts of 6, 3, 5, and 6 over the last 4 games, 13 month targets. Hayden Hurst might be out there. Baltimore's been a pretty good matchup for tight ends. He's 21 targets in 4 games. Juwan Johnson, I think, and Taysom Hill, lesser extent Taysom Hill, with Alvin Kamara likely back. But Juwan Johnson, Seattle's 32nd adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. They just gave up 179 yards and 2 touchdowns to TJ Hawkinson when the Lions really didn't have too many other weapons. They did give up Kyle Pitts' best game, 5 for 87 to Kyle Pitts. Hunter Henry is sort of interesting. You got to keep an eye on Jonnu Smith. If Jonnu's back, then I'm not as high on Hunter Henry. But if Jonnu sits, then Hunter Henry playing 80-90% of the snaps against the Lions is not a bad player to roll out there in a situation like this. Will Dissly, believe it or not, we're talking about Will Dissly, Anthony, but he has got a touchdown and 34 plus yards in 3 of his 4 games. He has a goose egg in the other game, so he has a low floor, but he's a favorite red zone touchdown target for Geno Smith, who's playing well. And then finally, not finally, but another guy, Cade Otton, rookie for the Buccaneers. If Cameron Brate is out, he's had a concussion, but if he's back, then obviously you can't really play Cade Otton. But if Brate is out, then Otton looks like a decent start. 25th adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. The Falcons are. They gave up 9 for 91 to Cleveland last week, tight ends, and then 9 for 105 and a touchdown to Seattle tight ends the week before. And then finally, because of the Dawson Knox news, the backup there is Quinton Morris. I think he came out in 2021 in the draft. Pittsburgh is 19th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. And the reason I'm mentioning Morris is that he's decently athletic and decent pass catcher. And, the Bills are kind of down bad right now at receiver. So there might be a few more targets available for the tight end.
All right, moving to the Bills wide receiver situation. So it's not just the tight end, Dawson Knox, that's banged up. Isaiah McKenzie remains in concussion protocol, according to Bills head coach Sean McDermott. You've also got Gabe Davis that continues to be gimpy. And then Khalil Shakir is also dealing with a potential injury. So when you're looking at this wide receiver group for the Bills, Jake Kumaro also, I don't think he practiced earlier this week, so you might as well throw him in there too. John, what do you make? What is this just? I mean, obviously, it's not like you're not going to start Stephon Diggs, but is there anybody else in that group that you'd be considered that you would consider streaming, I should say?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can start Gabe Davis. He's looking a little better in practice. I don't think he's 100%, but in this situation, the Steelers 26th in adjusted fantasy points to all the receivers. The team's not very healthy at receiver. So, I mean, you're not confident in Gabe Davis right now. You'd like to be able to bench him and see a week or two of good production before you put him back in. And then I think after that, if McKenzie is active, then I think he's a quality start. I've got Khalil Shakir right now at wide receiver 48 and half PPR. With the understanding that he's probably the starting slot receiver if McKenzie has to sit. If McKenzie plays, then I think I'll have him higher than where I have Shakir. So I probably will have him in the mid 30s to mid 40s. He's had some good games, even playing limited snaps and sharing time with Jamison Crowder, who's definitely going to be out. He fractured his ankle. So if we can get McKenzie into a 70-80% snap roll, then I think we're going to get some really good production out of him. But it might not happen until next week if McKenzie can't get cleared this week.
All right, John, moving into storyline number 3, let's stay with wide receivers. Rashad Bateman of the Ravens. He's dealing with a foot injury. He remains sidelined at practice on Thursday. Not looking good. Sunday night is the game for the Ravens. So if you got Rashad Bateman and you want to play him, you're looking at kind of a time crunch here. If Rashad Bateman doesn't at least get, I don't know, maybe even a limited session in on Friday, which would be today, Devin Duvernay, talk to us about him. He's kind of been, I know he had one big week, and he also had one game where he returned a kickoff for a touchdown, but obviously that doesn't matter from a fantasy perspective. You're just talking about him as a wide receiver. But Devin Duvernay, do you look at him maybe as a streaming option this week?
Yes, I think assuming Bateman is out, I think that Duvernay is a reasonable pivot. I don't think I'll have him as ranked as high as where I typically have Bateman, which would be probably the 20s right now, half PPR. But if you look at Duvernay so far this season, he obviously had a huge week 1, 4 for 54 and 2 touchdowns on 4 targets, 2 for 42 on 2 targets in week 2, 2 for 25 and a touchdown on 2 targets in week 3, and against Buffalo, 4 for 51 on 5 targets. So the reason I mention all that is because he's caught 12 of 13 targets for 172 yards and 3 touchdowns. So I think he is a legitimate sneaky start if Bateman sits. Even if Bateman plays, I guess you could argue that Duvernay might have some upside if Bateman has a setback or can't play a full complement of snaps. The only problem here is that the Bengals are 3rd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers, but I don't know that matters a whole lot if Bateman sits. This passing attack really funnels through 2 players typically, and it's been a little bit different this year because Duvernay has been so productive in his targets. But if it's Duvernay and Andrews, I think he's likely to have a pretty good game.
All right, the Patriots will likely be without Mac Jones until week 6 at the earliest. He's still hobbling around on a bad ankle. That means rookie Bailey Zappi will also play. He was rushed into action last week when Brian Hoyer got hurt, and Zappi played very well against your Packers. At least the Patriots did a nice job managing the game. I mean, it's not like he went out there and slung it all over the yard like he was Aaron Rodgers, but they did a nice job managing the game. He made plays in the passing game. The running game was pretty good. But when you look at the Patriots and some of their skill position players with Bailey Zappi in, John, what do you think? What's kind of the domino effect there?
Yeah, and I think we'll talk a little bit about a couple of sneaky starts later in the podcast stream. But as for Zappi, I think he does sap a little bit of the, you'd rather have Mac Jones in there and have them running a normal sort of offense where they throw the ball a certain amount of times and are a threat for 200, 250 yards passing. I don't know that Zappi is. Maybe this week against the Lions, because the Lions defense is not good, but he is, I guess, sort of a sneaky start from that aspect because the matchup is so good and the Lions are bound to put up some points. And if the Patriots can't control the Lions offense, then they're going to have to throw the ball a little bit more than they want to. But you look at the box score last week and he was sort of thrust into this situation, but 10 for 15, 99 yards and a touchdown. Pretty good quarterback rating. All things considered, he didn't run the ball at all. He's supposed to have a little bit of speed or ability to take off and run, but looking at his college stats, it doesn't look like he ran very often. So you're probably looking at a pocket passer and a really run heavy game plan for the Patriots. They're going to try to muck this game up and keep it low scoring if they can, and run the ball quite a bit. So I wouldn't, I don't know that we're really in a position to trust too many of these pass catchers for the Patriots. Nelson Aguilar had 4 targets, 46 yards. Devontae Parker caught a touchdown, 24 yards and a touchdown. Bourne had 23 yards receiving. Pretty ugly box score due to the low yardage for Bailey Zappi.
All right, we'll do kind of a week 5 injury roundup right now. I'll throw a couple of names at you. David Montgomery, running back for the Bears, back at practice. He was limited on Thursday. Amon-Ra St. Brown is, I believe he returned to practice. I saw that just as we were coming on. So it looks like St. Brown, John, is going to play this weekend against New England. By the way, a couple of updates here. Amon-Ra St. Brown return to practice on Friday. Kyle Pitts is not practicing today. So going back to a previous discussion that we had on Kyle Pitts, things do not look good for Kyle Pitts with that hamstring, but it looks like a game time decision for him. But again, St. Brown did practice. Swift did not practice on Thursday. He's looking doubtful. CeeDee Lamb held out for precautionary reasons. Kadarius Toney and then Kenny Golladay both out. So the Giants wide receiver situation, again, a mess. Just kind of a injury roundup for you, John. Other thoughts there?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the St. Brown news as well. According to Field Yates, Dan Campbell says that St. Brown will practice today for the first time this week. To be determined if he plays on Sunday. See if he has a shot to play. So we'll see how it goes. This is a good sign. Certainly, you'd rather have him out there trying to practice on Friday versus just sitting out and then hoping he can somehow be active on Sunday. So this affects a number of things. If he's back, then Tom Kennedy is back to the bench. Josh Reynolds, I was blanking on Josh Reynolds' name. I actually started him in our league last week. Josh Reynolds, wouldn't be as appealing of a start because, St. Brown comes back in and just absorbs a ton of targets. DJ Chark's also back. So all of a sudden, if this happens for Jared Goff, he's looking more appealing as a streamer if he gets, his favorite slot receiver back. Trusting him, I would probably trust him if he's available to play. I probably would run him out there. He's been so productive when he's been active thus far in his career, especially over the last half of last season and then the start of this season. It just would definitely impact in a negative manner the upside for Reynolds and for DJ Chark.
Can't believe you keep forgetting Josh Reynolds of all people.
Well, let me comment on those other names that you mentioned. I just kind of got off onto my Detroit receiver spiel there, but David Montgomery didn't sound like too optimistic that he was going to play. He just said he was like, kind of taking it day by day and wanted to be out there playing. He says he feels great, but we'll see. So if he's a full practice today, then I feel better about him. Khalil Herbert, a great play if Montgomery is sidelined. If Montgomery plays, then you might see them sort of limit his touches a bit, and Khalil Herbert is a better, more of a sneaky start flex type play. Lamb, I'm not worried about. Sounds like that's not a big deal. And then this Giants receiving core, I don't know that I can remember in my 20 years of doing this, or at least playing fantasy, 25 years playing fantasy, that I can't remember a receiving core that is this down bad. Like they started the season with just not that much talent, very unsettled, and they lost their best guy, Sterling Shepard. Kadarius Toney now has injured his other hamstring. I think I saw Wan'Dale Robinson didn't practice today, or had a setback. I don't know if it's a setback, but I don't think he practiced today. Kenny Golladay is out. And Daniel Jones is not the best quarterback as it is, but you're just taking away every one of his weapons, basically, just really hamstringing him. So it's really going to be, I don't know how they're going to try to beat the Packers. I think it's going to be Saquon Barkley, maybe some Bellinger at tight end, and then the occasional Richie James, I guess, Sills or whoever else
yeah.
they run out there.
David
I mean,
Sills.
Slayton, Darius Slayton is, popped his head up a few years ago and has just been in the doghouse, but maybe he gets a chance to play 70-80% of the snaps this week.
Yeah, they're going to run the ball 80 times. They're going to run the ball every play.
That might work because the Packers, they're more vulnerable against the run than they are the pass. So that might work for them.
Yeah, it's going to be the Saquon show, and I think Daniel Jones is going to see a lot of rushing yards as well. All right, let's move forward here. Sleeper is one of the fastest growing customizable fantasy football platforms in the industry. You can head to sleeper.com or download the latest app today. As regular listeners and viewers know, John and I use Sleeper in our league that we do together, and it's a great site. In fact, right before we came on, I was looking at the Kyle Pitts injury information, and I know I'm going to have to make a move there because I have Kyle Pitts on my team. So it's easy to use. The app is user friendly, and we really like it. We've been using it for the last couple of years. So now it's time for the Sleeper Sneaky Start of the week. This is John's favorite sneaky start. I nailed it again, John. I'm 2 for 2. Things are rolling now. It's officially week 5. It's almost like I needed my preseason. The teams don't need, they really don't have their preseason. So it's like September football winds up being their preseason. It's just like that for me too. Now the games start to count a little bit more. But without further ado, who is your sleeper sneaky start of the week?
I'm very impressed. You've totally buttoned that up so
Thank
far. I think we're done. I think we might be done with that. You having to say that in this podcast. So I think you got through it.
Sure.
Robert Woods. I don't know if he's my favorite sneaky start of the week, but he is definitely a player that intrigues me, given the Treylon Burks injury. And then Woods, even without that, prior to the injury, he's kind of come to life. He had 4 for 85 and on 9 targets, and then 4 for 30 and a touchdown on 4 targets in the last 2 weeks. The Commanders are the best matchup of the bunch. They're 31st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. So I think Bobby Trees has another good game this week.
All right, let's talk about John's sneaky starts. And this is just, I like to remind people, if you go to 4for4.com and you are a subscriber, you can get all of John's sneaky starts for the entire week. He lists many quarterbacks, tight ends, wide receivers, and running backs as options. This is just kind of a teaser. This is just your appetizer, right? But if you go to 4for4.com and you want to look at all of John's sneaky starts of the week, I highly recommend it. For me, it's a must. It's a go-to each and every week, whether I'm looking at my year-long teams or when it comes to DFS and you're trying to find some values. There's nobody better in the industry when it comes to sneaky starts and kind of finding guys with value. So, John, with that said, why don't we talk about Teddy Bridgewater, who is going to get a start this Sunday against the Jets with the injury, of course, to Tua Tagovailoa.
Yeah, and in the article, I like to discuss players that are ranked higher than they normally would be due to either injuries ahead of them or really good matchups or something along those lines. And I think the situation with Tua Tagovailoa, he's going to be out. So you've got Teddy Bridgewater stepping in. He's a very capable quarterback, career yards per attempt, I think, of 7.2, 7.3, which is solid.
Yeah.
Nothing spectacular, but solid. And I think it, better than some of the starting quarterbacks that are out there these days. He played 61% of the snaps in week 4, turned in 193 yards, a touchdown, 1 pick against the Bengals. I think the reason that he intrigues me is that he's got, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, and a very aggressive Mike McDaniel calling plays. So I think it's a pretty good, situation for him to step into. The Jets have allowed 230 yards, 1.8 touchdowns per game. They're not like an incredible matchup for quarterbacks, but they're kind of mediocre, 12th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. But I think, in a situation where you're, kind of struggling at quarterback, you could plug Bridgewater in there, and certainly in super flex or 2 quarterback leagues, he's a fine start this week.
Yeah, I think that number that you threw out there for yards per attempt is higher than Kyler Murray right now. So you're right. That's an interesting nugget. All right, the Detroit Lions, as we know, shredded a week ago by Seattle. They've been shredded all season. So when you're looking at some sneaky starts for this week, how about Damian Harris and Ramondre Stevenson against the Lions?
Yeah, I alluded to this when we were talking about Mac Jones and Bailey Zappi, who might be twins, by the way. They look really similar. I think Bailey Zappi might come out and they might think it's Mac Jones or vice versa. They definitely could pull some tricks there.
Yeah.
But they're going to really try to go run heavy. They went run heavy against the Packers. I think they're going to continue. They do have a really good running game. They were their offensive line was just pushing the Packers defensive line around for most of the game. And, Damian Harris, I think, really turned into a value as the draft season went on, because the Ramondre Stevenson hype, which was somewhat justified. I mean, I think we see that he's a good player. But he sort of overtook Harris in terms of ADP, and Harris was going, 8th, 9th round, and that was too low for a guy who's still a starter for the Patriots, still just a great touchdown scorer. He has scored a touchdown in 13 of his last 15 games and has 17 touchdowns in that span. So you might have a game where he doesn't, he only gets you 67 yards rushing and doesn't score a touchdown, and you're disappointed in it. But most of the time, he's giving you 67 yards plus a touchdown. And he's a little bit more involved as a receiver this year. And then you look at Stevenson and the way they're going run heavy, he's got 16 and 18 touches in the last 2 weeks, on top of this whole Damian Harris as a starter, plugging away at RB1 numbers. So I do think they're trying to hide the quarterback situation, and they can do it against the Lions. They're going to run and run and run. And the Lions are 31st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running back. So I think both of these guys are startable. The Lions have given up 5.31 yards per carry and 2 touchdowns to running backs this season on average. So this is a situation where they're both pretty startable as RB2s.
And then, John, one wide receiver that you want to point out, Noah Brown. Noah Brown has been pretty solid for the Cowboys, playing opposite CeeDee Lamb. As we mentioned before, CeeDee Lamb a little banged up, but he was also held out for precautionary reasons. It sounds like he will play against the Rams. But talk to us about Noah Brown. The Rams kind of surprisingly struggling defensively against the passes here.
Yeah, they're second to last in the league, or last in the league in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. They're showing up 32nd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. So, which is surprising. I mean, they typically have a pretty good defense. So this is, you're not expecting this, but you're looking at Noah Brown this year. Even last week, I'll just start there because Michael Gallup was back. He still saw 6 targets. He caught 3 for 61. Played 79% of the snaps, which is about what he's been playing. Previous week, 5 for 54 on 7 targets. The previous week against Cincy, 5 for 91 and a touchdown on 5 targets. And then week 1, 5 for 68 on 9 targets. And that was with Dak Prescott and Cooper Rush, I think, in that game. But he does have a pretty good rapport with Cooper Rush. And I don't think that he's just going to go away. I think they're running, Gallup out there. They're ramping him up. But Brown has been consistent. And I think, looking at some of where my peers have ranked him, I think he's being slept on a little bit this week. So I think he's a good sneaky start against the Rams, as I mentioned, 32nd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers.
All right, we'll wrap up the show here with the breakout receiver model. We introduced this last week because, John, you needed a couple of weeks of data before you started to make some recommendations when it came to certain guys that could be breakouts. So when you're looking at this week's breakout receiver model, and if you want to talk a little bit about last week too, feel free. But looking to this week breakout receiver model, who stands out?
Yeah, you asked about last week, and I don't remember who I discussed in this on this stream, but Chris Olave was the number 1 guy in the model, and I
believe we did mention him.
Delivered a good game. Marquise Brown was second. He had a good game. Elijah Moore, Terry McLaurin, Cortland Sutton, Deontay Johnson, Kyle Pitts are the next few guys. CeeDee Lamb popped in the model too, and I think he had a good game. So this week we have some of the same names because they didn't break out last week. Olave is still up there, but his expected points are 20.5 because of he's leading the league in air yardage by a wide margin. Some of those are prayer yards from Jameis Winston, but 20.5 is expected. He scored 14.8. You really can't complain about his production. He's still underperforming based on the usage. Terry McLaurin, I think, has a chance this week with Jahan Dotson out to have a nice game. Elijah Moore, we're sort of in a wait and see with him how this is going to shake out with Garrett Wilson and Corey Davis there, and Zach Wilson at quarterback. Things have changed a little bit there. A couple other players I wanted to mention that you don't usually see in this model. Jamar Chase is popping a little bit. It might be time for him to have a breakout game and find the end zone. Deontay Johnson is has been underperforming his usage a little bit. Again, there's a quarterback change there. So we're not sure exactly how Kenny Pickett's going to approach everything, but his teammate George Pickens is also popping in the model as well. And then Justin Jefferson has been underperforming a little bit as well. He's a highly efficient player. His P10 efficiency in the model is 134.7, which is, basically he's performing 134% in the previous 10 games prior to the span that the model looks at. So that's one thing we look at is how good of a player and how efficient of a player was the player before their little swoon. And he's having a little bit of swoon, but could break out and have a nice game, catch a couple touchdowns or at least one touchdown. And then finally, just got to keep mentioning him until we have to sort of redact him. That's a hat tip to Josh Herbsmeyer, who did the buy low model at 444 a while back. He, after at a certain point, he just sort of gave up on players. But Kyle Pitts has the second most air yards at his position. People ask me, would you cut him? And I would not. I think he's too talented, and maybe you bench him and stream the position for a while. But given the nature of the tight end position this year, I just can't see cutting a talent like Kyle Pitts unless I'd have a bench of like 2 or something. He's just too good, and he did well last year. And I think they have to figure this out if they're going to try to continue to compete this year.
They're running the ball. They're running the ball well, and I think they threw what they either had. I think Mariota had 7 completions or something last week. If they're running the ball well, Arthur Smith is not going to put the ball in the air much. So I've got Kyle Pitts. I understand the frustration. I kept him, as John. He was one of my keepers, and I would do it again. They're going to be behind. They're probably going to be. I hope he plays this week. It doesn't seem like he will, but they're going to be behind in games, and then they're going to have to put the ball in the air a lot more. So I think Pitts is going to be fine when it's all said and done. In fact, I would be looking to acquire him. Honestly, you probably get him cheap.
Yeah, perhaps as a buy low. The other thing I want to note on the breakout receiver model is that this week, Jeff Hicks over at 444 took that over, so he's getting the data from Kevin Zutlukel. I'm getting it as well. I'm using it in my rankings. But Jeff is going to be writing that up and sort of giving a fantasy spin on some of these players because, the model is great, but it's just pure numbers. There's no fantasy context to it. So it doesn't know if there's a quarterback change. It doesn't know if there's a receiver coming back or if the player is injured, like, Kyle Pitts. Sterling Shepard's popping in the model this week. We know he's not going to play. So there needs to be some fantasy context to it, and Jeff Hicks is going to write that up weekly. It's one of my favorite articles or models to have because it does just show that some of these underperforming players are getting the usage that they need. And the situation like Pitts, especially, like, there's easy to write him off because he's just hasn't had much production at all, but the usage is there. So it's those underlying fundamentals that typically will regress, and in this way, in this manner, probably regress positively. And he gets back to where he's sort of a normal 100% P10 type of a producer. And then all of a sudden he's back in the top 5, top 4 fantasy tight ends. So, those are if the player is getting no usage or very low usage, we can see it in the model as well and say, okay, it is time probably to cut this player because he's not seeing any air yards. He's not seeing as many routes run, et cetera.
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if we're still talking about Kyle Pitts being a massive disappointment as the year rolls on. It's going to take a little while, of course, but it's going to take a little patience. But, we'll continue to kind of monitor that. Don't forget, go to 444.com. If you don't have a subscription, everything that we're talking about in this podcast, it's just expanded on. I mean, you get John's complete rankings. You get all of the articles that we produce at 444.com, whether it's DFS betting or year-long related breakout model. I mean, the content is fantastic. A lot of times, I'll start to get yelled at a little bit on Sundays because I'm spending a little bit too much time diving into all the content that we have. But I love it, and I know a lot of subscribers have won their leagues and have won DFS because of it. So, John, keep up the great work. And if you want to give John a follow on Twitter at 444_John, I'm at Anthony Stalter. If you're so inclined, we appreciate everybody listening and watching the Most Accurate Podcast. We'll be back next Friday for Week 6. Everybody, good luck this weekend.